Hey, Crew and Nikki. Just trying to break this up into pieces for you. So I just talked about science and sort of a very crude and unorganized discussion of philosophy of science and the limitations of scientific knowledge. And I talked about that as it relates to faith. And there's a faith, based on that, there's a faith involved in science. Now, I'm going to talk about the Baha'i faith and why I'm a Baha'i, why I continue to be a Baha'i after, the sort of deconstructivist view and postmodernist view of the world. So, if you look at religion in general, I think it's really hard to know. So this is an ontological question. What is religion? It's hard to know what religion is and what we mean by religion, because it's so hard to differentiate people's ideas of religion and people's and the institutions of religion, which are created by human beings, from this idea that there's a religion or there's a God or there actually is something real out there. And it's the same problem we have with all knowledge. We construct this knowledge, we wrap it up in a little package so we can make sense of it and manipulate it. But we probably left off bits of it and packaged it incorrectly, so it's not completely logical. It doesn't make sense if examined extensively. So when I look at religion, I was raised in the Baha'i faith, and there's a whole body of writings there. And there's sort of this iterative process you have to go through if you want to decide whether or not you believe a religion. And it's circular by nature. But in the same way that belief in the place we live in is circular, because I believe that the world exists and that it works in a logical way because I have experience of that. But my experiences are all modulated through, are presupposed by belief that it exists. So it's this weird thing where, my observations over my life lead me to believe that something exists that my observations may not truly represent fairly. And I think that, so if you look at religion, and specifically the Baha'i faith, I believe in the Baha'i faith because the writings and teachings of the Baha'i faith seem to be logical and consistent for the most part to me. Now, if you look at the teachings of the Baha'i faith, you start out with the idea of what God is, and what in the Baha'i faith we believe that God is an unknowable essence. And we believe that God provides guidance to humankind at various times through these prophets or messengers. So if you start with those kind of assumptions, that's sort of the ontology and epistemology right there. So ontologically, God is this unknowable essence. So it's something that we can't know, but is there and we can kind of get glimpses of. And if you think about it, that becomes very similar to what I just talked about scientifically about the real world. And we learn about God through these messengers and manifestations that come at various times, according to the Baha'i faith, come at various times and places to offer mankind guidance. And the religion itself actually sheds some light on the reality of the spiritual world that we live in. And based on that, my dad always used to say to me, the Baha'i writings should be like an owner's manual for your life. They tell you things that you can do to increase the probability that you're going to have positive outcomes. So there may be laws in there may be rules. If you follow those, things are more likely to go well for you. Doesn't mean that if you break a rule one time, everything's going to come crashing down. And one of the other interesting things about the Baha'i faith is that Baha'u'llah actually says, Baha'u'llah is the prophet, we believe was a prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, who we believe also comes in a long lineage of manifestations of God, like Muhammad, Christ, Zoroaster, Moses, a whole series of manifestations of God. But he says, we all worship a God of our own making. in the writings. And basically, if you read around that, what he's saying is the same thing, the social construction of knowledge. He's essentially saying, we can't understand God, so we build this model of God in our head that we all have, and we all think that's what God is, and we worship that God, but that's not God. You know, we're all wrong, essentially. So that makes a lot of sense to me. There's also the teachings of the Baha'i faith. There's also a lot of things in there about how we are all human. And so if you look at the institutions, they're all, they may be guided through principles from the manifestations of God, but the longer people have them, the more generations of people, it's like the game telephone, the more generations of people who have them and manipulate them, you know, they become more and more distorted, and they become corrupted. And I think if you look at institutions across societies, across the history of mankind, you'll see that this is true. Whether it's capitalism, communism, democracy, religion, any of these institutions that we create, we try to create these institutions to protect ourselves from our own greed and avarice and poor behavior. But you see that all of these institutions become corrupted by human beings, and humans have an ability, if they want to, and that they're selfish, to corrupt any institution. So you can look at religion and you can say, you know, religion is just one of those institutions that human beings have corrupted. Now, the whole Marxist critique of religion, the idea that religion is the opiate of the masses, and that you know, if we could just get rid of religion, we'd be okay. Well, everybody sees what happened with socialism and communism, is that you saw those same corruptions creep into those institutions as have crept into religious institutions. So you could make the argument that religion isn't evil in and of itself, which is the argument against religion. So so essentially, you know, when I look at the Baha'i faith, you know, there's a whole bunch of, having read extensively the writings of the Baha'i faith, having applied the writings in my life, I have found that they have worked for me, and they have helped me to be a happier and healthier person and be more satisfied in my life. And so, you know, the teachings that people object to in the Baha'i faith are often social, about, you know, like you can't drink, you can't have sex outside of, you're not supposed to have sex outside of marriage, and all those things to me are very practical things. You know, I come from a family where my dad's side of the family, everyone was alcoholics, and I have a very strong, you know, obsessive compulsive side, and I have lots of the symptoms of dependency, but they're muted because I don't use alcohol or drugs. I never have. So, you know, that type of thing, I can see the wisdom of that. You know, I see the wisdom of not having sex outside of marriage, and you can argue about that. But anyway, basically, when I look at the teachings of the Baha'i faith, and from a very practical standpoint, they have worked really well in my life. They have helped me, and when I have crises in my life, I go back to those teachings, and I try to, you know, think about in the context of, they give me a framework for how the world should theoretically work spiritually, and I apply those teachings in my life. So, you know, detachment from material things, you know, I can let, you know, right now we're in a really good place materially. We have a nice house, I have lots of stuff, I have too many guitars and video cameras and stuff, but I'm okay if those things go away. I might not be thrilled about it, but I think I'm detached enough from those things that it's okay if they break or I lose them or whatever. You know, and that's one of the principles of Baha'i faith, is being detached from material things. Now, obviously, you don't have to be a Baha'i to have that. Anyway, there's a ton of these types of things. You know, that communication, there's outlined in the Baha'i faith this idea of consultation, and it's group-making decision-making. It's group-based decision-making, and we use that in our family for decision-making. Sarah and I use that for decision-making processes. And, you know, it's one of those things where, since we agree on it, you know, if we get in a fight or an argument, you know, usually it's because one of us hasn't had enough to eat, or we're grumpy, or we're PMSing, one of us. And usually we can step away and come back and go back to those core principles outlined in consultation and come to an agreement. Because we both, well, we love each other and we care and we want to solve the problem. But, you know, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but basically, I'm a Baha'i because I see a consistency. I see a logic to it. I see a set of core principles, which I haven't covered in depth here because it's just too much to cover. And they have been useful in my life. And I don't see any logical inconsistency with a scientific approach to looking at the Baha'i faith. All of that said, I also recognize that not only could I be wrong in this, I am undoubtedly wrong in my understanding of this. Even if, like, the Baha'i faith is completely true and completely right, my understanding of it is incomplete and is wrong, and I'm applying it in my life in a way that's incomplete and incorrect. But it's still better than nothing. So you know, it's sort of a catch-22 there. So, you know, I don't, even though, you know, there are principles in the Baha'i faith that in contemporary society people do things all the time that Baha'is are not supposed to do, I don't judge about that because I recognize that I could be wrong. And just because all this works for me and it makes sense to me, you know, I could be wrong. And I don't need, and it doesn't do me any harm. Well, it may do me harm, you know, if a drunk person shoots me or something, or, you know, but for the most part, all these behaviors are not the most important thing. They're just things to help us be healthier and happier. So, I think that's most of what I wanted to say. Yeah. So what I wrote down here is why I'm a Baha'i. I have an imperfect model of the world in my head. Most bad decisions that I make are because my expectations of how the world will work is different from the way the world actually works. Actually, that's interesting. I didn't bring this up, but I think, you know, from a scientific perspective, you know, where we run into problems is when we expect the world to work in a certain way and it doesn't, and something fails. And that's usually because the mental model that we have, our understanding of the world, is incomplete or incorrect. And so, based on my understanding of the world, the Baha'i teachings seem consistent and rational, and the Baha'i teachings are true. If they're true, then they represent a more complete and accurate model of the world than the one I carry in my head, and so I can learn from it. Anyway, I'm sorry, that kind of rambled, and I don't know how long this ended up, but I figured I should just make these videos because unless I made the videos, they just weren't going to get made, and I don't have the time to put into making them really good. So that kind of goes along with this whole theme of introspection that we've been riffing on for the last week or two, but kind of going back to the fast when we were talking about that. So that's why I'm a Baha'i, and that's why I fast and do other things like that. So, assuming that there is no life after death, or maybe there is life after, assuming that there is life after the death, I'm still dead.